During the Second World War, there were many different war crimes committed by different armies. In particular, in the Pacific Theatre, the Japanese conducted scores of atrocities and killings of civilians and prisoners of war, and they became notorious for their ill treatment of captives. After the conflict had come to an end, there were very few Japanese war criminals who were executed or imprisoned for their actions in countries such as China, Malaya, and other lands they tried to conquer. A few high-profile members of the Japanese government were executed for their role in the war crimes, but ultimately millions of innocent people were killed by the Japanese. There was one horrific war crime committed inside of a hospital established in Singapore by the British, and it showed how cruel and savage the Japanese could be. Join us today as we look at the horrific executions of Alexandra Hospital, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Singapore was considered a major British trading port, and the land around it needed protection. So because of this, a hospital was created for sailors and soldiers who were injured or wounded. By the late 1930s, Singapore was seen as a key territory and thousands flocked to it to create new developments and infrastructure, with construction booming there. The British Army established a 32-acre site near to a railway line in Alexandra, where a new British military hospital would be built and set up. By the time the Second World War broke out, construction on the Alexandra Hospital was well underway, but the British were not entirely treating workers too well. Many of the labourers were Chinese women, and they worked very hard in tough conditions, but shortly after war broke out in September 1939, the Alexandra Hospital was nearly ready to be opened. It officially opened on the 19th of July 1940, and was described as one of the most up-to-date and one of the largest military hospitals outside Great Britain. It was fitted with blast walls to protect it, but at the end of July 1940, the War Office gave huge sums of money, what would be around £3 billion now, to Singapore, to help shore up the defences of the land. This was as the threat from the Japanese loomed. More expansion took place at the Alex Hospital, and during the conflict there was a shortage of beds. Thousands of workers were working there at the hospital, from nurses and doctors to cooks and specialists. However, on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese bombs rained down on Singapore, taking the people by surprise. Within a few days, 2 British ships were sunk, and it was looking likely that the Japanese were going to target Singapore and to strike in the lands. As more attacks occurred on Singapore and the Malayan Peninsula, the Alex Hospital saw swathes of prisoners brought through the doors, and it became overcrowded. Some patients were left underneath tables and outside in the gardens, and the staff there would work their hardest to try and save as many patients as they could. Alongside British soldiers were many Australian soldiers and other Allied casualties, but on the 14th of February 1942, a horrific war crime would take place at the Alexandra Hospital. Conditions at the time in the hospital were poor, and there was a lack of rations for food and water. Torches and lights were saved for surgical procedures, and there was a huge problem regarding where to bury corpses. But the hospital was caught in the path of an advance by General Yamashita. The fighting in Singapore was fierce, and the Commonwealth forces tried their best to hold out. But on the 14th of February, the Japanese assaulted the western part of the defences that the 1st Malayan Brigade had tried to hold out the day before. At around 1 p.m, the Japanese forces advanced towards the Alexandra Hospital. As the Japanese were rushing there, a British lieutenant approached the Japanese soldiers waving a white flag, with the intent to surrender the site over to the Japanese peacefully and to save the hospital. The envoy with the surrender flag was then cut down brutally with a bayonet instantly. The war crimes would then continue inside the hospital. The account of Lieutenant F.T. Moore, who was based inside the hospital, carries the true horrors that occurred there. He wrote, "During the early morning, the water supply was cut off, shelling and air activity became intense, some of the shells bursting in and many landing near the hospital. These appeared to be mainly mortar bombs, with an occasional shot from the artillery. The enemy were drawing nearer and approaching the rear of the hospital. The number of incoming patients had lessened considerably, and there was little or no traffic in the wards. During the morning routine, work continued. Japanese troops were seen for the first time at 1:40 p.m, attacking towards the sisters' quarters. They were about to enter from the rear when Lieutenant Weston went from the reception room to the rear entrance with a white flag to indicate the surrender of the hospital. The Japanese took no notice, and Lieutenant Weston was bayoneted to death by the first Japanese to enter. These troops now entered the hospital and ran amok on the ground floor. They were very excitable and jumpy, neither pointing to the Red Cross symbol or shouting the word hospital had any effect. So the Japanese entered the hospital and ran riot, but the savagery continued, and it was shocking. Lieutenant Moore continues. One Japanese party entered the theatre block and climbed into the corridor and shot through a window, wounding Private Lewis in the arm. Around 10 Japanese came into the corridor, and all the medical personnel held up their hands. Captain Smiley pointed towards the Red Cross, but they took no notice. They then motioned the staff to move along the corridor, when for no reason the Japanese set upon the staff with bayonets. Captain Smiley was lunged at with a bayonet, but the blade struck aside and it hit his cigarette case in his left breast pocket. He was then again lunged at and wounded. He pretended to be killed and pushed Private Sutton to the floor, calling to others to keep quiet. After 20 minutes, Lieutenant Rogers had been bayoneted twice through the back of the thorax and died at once. Captain Parkinson, Corporal McEwen and Private Lewis were also bayoneted to death. A patient, Corporal Holden, who was having surgery and on the operating table, had also been bayoneted to death. Another party of Japanese went into a ward and ordered the nurses and patients that could walk outside the hospital. 2 patients were bayoneted, and 2 Japanese soldiers went upstairs and gave similar instructions. Patients and personnel numbering 200 were taken outside, their hands tied behind their backs with a slipknot, one length of uncut cord being used for 4 or 5 men. Some patients could only hobble, 1 or 2 collapsed and had to be revived. They were then herded into small rooms nearby. Here the men were jammed in, and it took several minutes to raise one's hands above their heads. Sitting down was out the question, and men were forced to urinate against each other. During the night many men died and suffered from thirst and the suffocating atmosphere. Water was promised but never arrived. But the evening shelling was at its maximum. One struck the roof of the cells and injured some prisoners. Some men tried to escape, but some were successful, but others were shot by machine gun fire. Before these attacks, the Japanese had been taking small groups of soldiers from the hospital out of sight, and the ensuing yells and screams, coupled on one occasion with a soldier returning, wiping blood from his bayonet, left little doubt as to the men's fate. Another party of Japanese soldiers had gone into the reception room and were threatening the patients and staff. Sergeant Sheriff was bayoneted and died, and the remaining was similarly treated. Another party of Japanese went in towards 16 and 17, causing injuries, and entered the kitchens, killing Private Bruce with a Tommy gun. They were also seen firing and throwing hand grenades into the sisters' bunkhouse. At 4 p.m, 40 or 50 patients and staff were herded into a corridor, and guards watched over them. At 6 p.m, the Japanese took a party including Sergeant Anderson and about 20 others away. Their hands were tied, they were put in a drain, where they remained all night. Further atrocities upon the staff of Alexandra Hospital occurred. Around 50 soldiers, including those who were having surgery, were murdered by the Japanese, and doctors and nurses were also killed. The staff and patients who were kept in small, badly ventilated rooms were subject to horrifying conditions, and many were bayoneted to death on their journey there. The treatment that they had by the Japanese was shocking, and these people were technically prisoners of war and should have been given better. Some inside of the hospital only survived by pretending to be dead. In a 2-day massacre and act of brutality, the Japanese had executed and killed up to 300 soldiers, patients, and members of staff at the Alexandria Hospital. The hospital was also looted by the Japanese, but they did later express regret for what happened inside the hospital. But the Alexandra Hospital Massacre was just one of many brutal and shocking war crimes committed by the Japanese army as they advanced throughout Asia. There was very little reprisal for this horrific act, and after the war, there was practically no punishment brought forward relating to it. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.